We're now going to turn our attention to a different kind of identity. Up until now, the identities we've discussed have been practice manipulating the functions, showing that a large expression involving sines and tangents simplifies to maybe some other expression involving cosine and secants maybe. But now we're going to turn our attention to a different variety of identity. The point of these is not to be able to do a computation. The point is not to be able to verify them or even prove them. The point of this kind of identity is you will need to use them in some future time. In particular, but not only this, but in particular, if you have anything that remotely smacks of calculus in your future, you will be using these identities in the work you're doing there. What will probably occur is what occurred with me and probably every other student who's ever taken this. You learn them in trigonometry, and then you forget about them. And then when you take your calculus course, you need to relearn them. Well, that's going to start right here. I'm going to have you memorize these. These are the identities. You must actually have them memorized. For exams, I will give you the left-hand side of the identity, and you must write down the right-hand side of the identity. You must learn these so that when you get in your, let's say, Calculus 2 class, and Professor so-and-so says, okay, we have this value involving cosine, and we're going to use this identity to rewrite it in some other form, you know what they're talking about. And if you need to be able to do that, then at that time you'll look up the identity and you will recall it. Having memorized it once, it'll be easier to memorize the second time, and you'll use it in your calculus work or your physics work or whatever course you will encounter where these identities tend to get used over and over again. So I'm going to start with what are called the sum and different identities. The specific grouping of these is not relevant, but what you need to be able to do is memorize these, and so if I write down the left-hand side, you can supply the right-hand side. The first of which is this, sine of A plus B. Now, what this means is if you have sine of two angles, they can be measured in radians or degrees, they have to be measured in the same, but any two angles, the sine of the sum of two angles can be written as sine of the first cosine of the second plus cosine of the first times sine of the second. Now that seems like a lot. When I was a student, my memory device was sine is sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Not much of a memory device because it's just it. Notice that one thing you can rely on is this, A plus B. It's A, then B, A, then B. That will help to memorize this. Sine is sine, cosine, cosine, sine. We're going to have another one involving cosine here. It's a different sequence. Similar, but different. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. So sine of A plus B is sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Sine of A, cosine. So if you like, you can write down sine, leave it blank, cosine, leave it blank, but eventually you get this to where you're writing this as sine, cosine, cosine, sine, and the sequence of the A and B is the same as is given here. Now, there is also A minus B. And it turns out that this is the same. It's still sine, cosine, cosine, sine. And if this is plus, this is plus. Sine uses the same sign. If this is minus, this is minus. So it's the same sign. This is the same sequence. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Sine, cosine, same sign. Sine is the same sign. So my memory device as a student was sine is the same sign. You'll see how that comes into play here in just a bit. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. So if this is minus, sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Sine is sine, cosine, cosine, sine, and sine is the same sign. I say that because the next identity is cosine of A plus B. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine for sine. But cosine is similar but not the same. If this is all there were, that wouldn't be too much of a challenge. But there is also cosine of a plus b, and there's also cosine of a minus b. We also have tangent. I'm not going to expect you to memorize tangent. It doesn't get used in practice nearly as much as these two. So, sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Sine is sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Cosine, however, and it's just my memory device is just it. It is cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Sine is sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Cosine is cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Cosine, cosine. Notice they stay in the same order. Cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Cosine, cosine, sine, sine. And sine is the same sign. That's my memory device. Sine is the same sign. Sine is the same sign. Cosine is opposite. Sine is the same sign. Cosine is opposite. So if this is plus, this needs to be minus. And when this is minus, this pretty soon here is going to be a plus. Sine is sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Cosine is cosine, cosine, sine, sine. This is cosine, cosine, opposite, sine, sine. Let me make that clearer. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Sine is the same sign. Memorize those four. There are going to be about this many more. There's a slight modification later. These need to go into your memory. Make flashcards. Write them down repeatedly. Do what you need to do, but memorize these four. Memorize these four identities. Right? Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Sine is the same sign. Cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Whatever it takes, memorize those. Flashcards, just read it over and over again. Make up a song, make up some sort of memory device. Get those identities in your mind so that you have them whenever you need them. What I will do is I will write down the left-hand side, and you will supply the right-hand side. It needs to be correct. It needs to be absolute. Every detail needs to be correct. Sine is the same sign. Cosine is not. Sine's the same sign. Sine's the same sign. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. This is cosine, cosine, sine, sine. So memorize those four. Have those in your mind whenever you need them.